Flashcards are powerful, but what if your flashcard deck feels more like an overgrown thicket than a carefully cultivated garden? Do you clear away the weeds and bring it back under control, or burn it all down and start afresh? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about flashcards, and more specifically, what to do if you feel locked in by your flashcards or you feel you're spending too much time with them. I believe that flashcards can be a great tool for language learners. They make reviewing characters and words highly efficient and make sure you remember almost everything you've learned. When combined with spaced repetition software, flashcards allow you to expand vocabulary rapidly without forgetting too much. When misused or overused, however, flashcards can also become a trap. For some students, learning Chinese is, to a large extent, about creating and reviewing flashcards. The problem with this is that words and characters in Chinese don't exist in a vacuum, and so studying them out of context can only do so much for you. If you use your flashcard app so much that it stops you from reading and listening enough, this is also a big problem. So depending on how you look at it and how you use the flashcards, they can either be great for learning Chinese or terrible. This is a topic I've covered in a mini-series of articles and podcast episodes, and I'll put links to those in the show notes. And there I discuss the pros and cons of flashcards in detail. In my opinion, the best approach is to use flashcards with purpose and an active attitude, a bit like as if they were plants in a garden. This is the metaphor I want to stick with, so we're going to talk about how to cultivate your flashcard garden. And there are then many things you should do, both with plants and flashcards. First, if you want to have a garden, you need to plant something. And when it comes to flashcards, then you need to create or add flashcards. But don't add everything you come across when you read and listen, or indeed when you look at lists online. When planting a garden, you wouldn't plant every seed you could get your hands on. Instead, you would plant with a discrimination and purpose, and this is what you should do with flashcards too. Second, you need to water your plants or your flashcards. Review your flashcards regularly to enforce memory and prevent forgetting. Spaced repetition software is very good at this, and it works best if you use them regularly, just as if you water plants. Third, you need to prune. This means that you need to edit, update, or otherwise change the flashcards that you have added. There could be many reasons for doing this, but perhaps the original card wasn't very clear, it was confusing, or maybe ambiguous. The point is that you're unlikely to add the perfect flashcard for every piece of vocabulary you want to learn, and so being ready to edit and update them is crucial. How much control you have over your flashcards depends on what app you're using. In some you can customize basically everything, and in some you are stuck with the flashcards that you're given. Exercise the control you have. Fourth, you should weed out unwanted content. Remove, suspend, delete, or ban cards you no longer find useful or interesting, or that you don't like for some other reason. Weeding is extremely important and often overlooked, which we will talk about later in this episode, but if you don't do it, you will probably find that flashcards take over your life, and your flashcard garden will be anything but well tended. The key insight here is that there is always an opportunity cost. For every word or character that you keep, even though you don't find it useful or interesting, there is another character or word you can't learn that would have been useful or interesting. Number 5. Transplant. Carefully manage what card types you use. Do you, for example, really need to write everything by hand, or is it okay to just write a small subset? This will save you an awful lot of time that you can then invest into something else, including more flashcards of other types if you want, but preferably more listening and reading. There are many factors to consider when determining which types of flashcards to use. For example, listening cards and reading cards are very fast to review, almost instant if you know them well, whereas handwriting can take 10 times longer, so don't forget about the opportunity cost. Sixth, you should fertilize. Enrich your cards by adding context, images, example sentences, mnemonics, or just your own notes. In line with what I just said, you don't need to review all these things, but having all this information in one place can be quite helpful. Finally, enjoy watching it grow. If you follow these steps, your flashcards will develop into a beautiful, peaceful garden that brings joy and satisfaction. Your Chinese vocabulary will be extensive, allowing you to speak, listen, read, and write with ease. In the best of all possible worlds, we would all be able to cultivate our flashcard gardens. Unfortunately, we don't live in the best of all possible worlds, and I think nobody follows all the steps I listed above, and I don't even do it myself. It's an idealized way of dealing with flashcards and vocabulary in Chinese, but it requires you to know a lot of things you can't possibly know when you create your flashcards. For example, it's not easy to choose the right app or know how to use that app once you've chosen it. Your preferences and requirements will also change over time, and unless you know a lot about yourself as a language learner and know a lot about vocabulary acquisition and so on, this is almost impossible to predict. What usually happens is that students find a solution that works right now for their current situation, but then 6 months or 1 year or 2 years later, they realize that this is no longer adequate and the setup that they came up with as a beginner is no longer suitable. At this time, you might feel locked in. You maybe have thousands or perhaps even tens of thousands of flashcards, and the more you learn and as time goes by, they become more and more of a burden, and all that joy and satisfaction turns into pain and frustration. Instead of listening to Chinese podcasts you like, or reading a graded reader, or maybe having a conversation with a language exchange partner or a Chinese friend, you sit there and do your flashcards. Because if you don't, the due count will tick up and you will have thousands of cards to review. You might also find yourself in this situation if you've been using flashcards very seriously for a while and then need to take a break or take a break for some reason. And when you get back into your app after a month and you realize you have thousands of cards to review, and this doesn't feel good. Once your flashcard garden has turned into a thicket, you basically have two options. First, you can roll up your sleeves and adopt an aggressive attitude towards your flashcard garden and tidy up and clear things out. Second, you can burn it all down and start afresh. The second option is not as bad as it looks, so let's have a closer look. Deleting all flashcards sounds like a very radical approach, and in a sense it is, but it is also the approach that I recommend in many cases. Many years ago, I used to be strongly against nuking your flashcard deck to start over from scratch, but since then I've done so several times myself, and I should probably have done it the first time much earlier than I did. By the time I did burn everything down to start from scratch, I had collected some 30,000 unique flashcards in Anki, but I haven't regretted resetting my deck a single time since then. Starting over has several advantages. First, it will allow you to spend time learning Chinese, not editing flashcards. Second, you'll be able to review things that actually matter rather than agonizing over how to manage your vocabulary. Third, you free up time for listening and reading, and these are much more important than flashcards. Fourth, you can change apps and select one that's more suitable to your needs today rather than when you started learning. Fifth, you wake up from the nightmare. Learning Chinese is not just about flashcards. And finally, you can enjoy learning characters and words again. This podcast is not the right place to discuss the role of flashcards in your approach in general, but we did talk about that in episode 94 when we talked about Paul Nation's 4 strands. As usual, I'll put links in the show notes to other articles and episodes that I mention. Like I mentioned earlier, many learners, including myself then, hesitate to delete their flashcards in some kind of sunk cost fallacy. Essentially, what you're saying is that since I've spent so much time building this particular deck, I should keep investing time into it, otherwise all that earlier time will be wasted. Furthermore, deleting your flashcards also feels like deleting progress, and this might be particularly true if your app is good at showing you progress and tracking your progress, because obviously then if you delete everything, your progress will also be reset. But of course, your knowledge of Chinese is not measured in how many flashcards you have or what number is shown in an app somewhere. Flashcards are a means to an end, not the end in itself, something which many students, including myself in the past then, seem to forget. If your vocabulary solution or flashcard setup is no longer suitable, but you keep holding on to it anyway, this will have a negative effect on your learning, and it's not worth it. To summarize this bit, I think we can say that deleting flashcards sometimes can feel like deleting your memory of the words on those flashcards. This is clearly nonsense, however. Your knowledge of vocabulary resides in your brain, not in a flashcard app. It is true that the risk of forgetting the words you learned through that flashcard app will increase if you delete the flashcards, but this is mostly true for words you don't know very well, and you can then ask yourself, do you really need those words? Would it be such a bad thing if you forgot them and had to relearn some of them later? Generally speaking, I don't think you need to be afraid of losing important vocabulary. If it is important, it will turn up again in things you read and listen to, and you can learn it again later if you want to. The likelihood is, though, that most of the things you lose by deleting your flashcards are things you didn't really need anyway, and that will, as I've mentioned, free up time to do more important things. Many of the words you've added are probably not as important as you think. If you've listened this far and at least consider resetting your flashcards, I think you should probably do it. And even if you don't, you should at least consider the question seriously. And if you decide to keep your flashcards, you should make sure that you use them according to the guidelines that I set earlier. I should mention that if you decide to burn down your flashcard garden, it can be a good idea to save your rarest blooms. These could be words that you've collected in specific situations that might be very hard to replicate. For example, during the 2 years I studied a master's program for teaching Chinese as a second language in Taiwan, I practiced gymnastics on an amateur level quite seriously, and I learned a ton of vocabulary associated with artistic gymnastics in Chinese, and used flashcards to learn and remember many of these terms. Another example is terms for phonetics in Chinese, which I also studied in grad school, and I also relied on flashcards a lot. And so deleting these flashcards is maybe not such a good idea, especially since I want to be able to talk about these things in Chinese, but I don't do it often enough to keep this vocabulary alive without flashcards. Another situation where it makes sense to think twice before you burn everything down is if you've spent a lot of time collecting good and personal example sentences, added images, and all that good stuff that I talked about earlier when we talked about fertilizing. If these are tied to a specific app and they can't be migrated easily somewhere else, this increases the cost of deleting everything and starting from scratch. In some apps, such as Scritter, your custom definitions and notes and things like that associated with a vocabulary item are actually kept even if you delete everything and start from scratch, but this is not how most flashcard apps work. Still, it's important to separate out sentimental value from actual value, and your earlier notes might not be as important as you think. You can also keep the flashcards as notes, so something you can search in and find information about, but not something that you actively review. It's time to wrap up this episode, and the question I wanted to discuss today was, should you cultivate your Chinese flashcard garden or burn it down and start afresh? As we discussed, flashcards are powerful learning tools, but only when they serve your goals, not the other way around. If your deck has become a burden or your garden has become a thicket, maybe it's time to start over. This is particularly true if you feel that flashcards have taken time away from engaging directly with the language outside of flashcard apps through listening, reading, speaking, and writing. Then you really need to take action. So cultivate your garden if you can, burn it down if you must, but either way, don't get stuck in a flashcard app. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.